Well, good evening and a very warm welcome from Milim to this evening's presentation. Welcome to you wherever you are in the UK and indeed wherever you might be in the world. Our series of online talks and conversations continues with our guest Kate Pearlman-Shaw, and I'll introduce Kate to you in just a moment. Now, this evening our guest is local to Leeds, and you'll notice that we're both in the same place, and hopefully that will enhance the overall impression that you get this evening rather than us both being in little boxes on Zoom. Now, a little bit of housekeeping first. Please do ask questions. Do this by typing whatever you'd like to ask into the Q&A facility on your screen. We will try our best to get through as many of your questions as we can. Also, you have a chat facility, and you can use that to send a message to all of the other participants on this webinar, should you wish to do so. And finally, we are recording this event, and it will appear on the Milim website at milim.org.uk over the next couple of days, and there you will find recordings of other past events and details of our future programme for which you can book tickets. And so to our guest this evening. So after working for 18 years as a clinical psychologist, Kate Pearlman-Shaw has spent the past 20 years helping leaders to change their behaviours as a leadership development coach and facilitator. She's a double chartered psychologist with the British Psychological Society, holding both coaching and clinical psychologist qualifications. Kate has extensive experience running leadership development programs, coaching teams, coaching teams and individuals, where she uses the behavioural change skills and methods she's learned clinically in everyday work situations. These techniques are drawn from psychology, neuroscience, and leadership studies, enabling many leaders to overcome personal barriers and to change their behaviours in a key range of leadership situations. Kate is the author of this book, recently published, The Psychology of Effective Leadership. This works. Kate, a warm welcome to Milim. Really nice to have you with us.
Really nice to be with you.
So, start by telling us a little bit about you and your background and how you transitioned, as it were, from clinical work to leadership training.
Okay, so I was working here in Leeds as a clinical psychologist and very happy. Never thought I would do anything else. Jobbing clinical psychologist was what they call it. And I did the thing that you do to progress in your career. You go on a leadership development course. And I loved it. And then I was invited to convene the leadership development course. And that led me in all kinds of directions I never thought I'd go in. And as it happened, I wasn't going to progress here in Leeds because the people above me were same age kids. And Jonathan and I didn't want to move. And so I was asked to apply for a role which I could do from home, but travel, which was in leadership development, working with big organizations and using the same skills we used as clinical psychologists, but working to develop leaders. And that's how it all began. So it was completely unexpected.
I see.
Yeah. So 1 minute I was, in Leeds, I worked at Cookridge and Horsforth, and I worked in Hyroids. And the next minute I'm jetting off to South Africa. It was a big life change.
I can imagine. Yeah. But to end up with writing a book is a big jump. Was there something specific that made you want to write this?
It's the collection of tools I use to work when I'm developing leaders is an unusual set. I've always been quite what's called an eclectic practitioner. So I always draw from lots of different places. And I'm a bit of a magpie. So I've got a set of skills that don't normally go together, but they seem to work, which is why it's called This Works. It works for the people with whom I've worked. The only way to have access to all of this was to work with me. And I'm nearing the end of my career, so it felt like write it down. So I did. Yeah. Okay. So here's the book.
So how does this work? How can people use this book?
The idea is that there's I have 40 years worth of psychological knowledge. That's loads and loads of tools and skills. But there are 3 that I use most, and they form the basis for everything else. So the book works that there's 3 key, what I call base models, which is important to familiarize yourself with. And then you can go anywhere in the book. And the book then answers the 14 most asked leadership questions that I was asked probably between 2022 and 2024 when I wrote the book. And so then I use those methodologies plus a lot more to answer those questions.
So hopefully we'll look at a few of those questions later on if time allows. But let's look at these tools, these models. And you've got, I believe, 3 of those.
Yes.
So let's look at those in turn. So the first one?
The first one is about how your brain works. Don't you think it's useful to know how your brain works?
Well, I think it's very useful. And I actually, because after I've written all my questions, I asked AI, what should I ask Kate Pearlman-Shaw?
and
it said, how's the brain? What's the brain doing? What's the brain doing while this is happening? So, if I ask you what the brain's doing, it's not my question.
Okay.
But yeah, fire away. Tell us about the brain.
So despite the fact that the brain has, 80 billion neurons and, 3.5 miles of effectively wiring, there are 2 bits of the brain I think it's really important that we know about. And neurobiologists talk about the brain going into a state called the threat state and a state when the brain is in the reward state. Now, when the brain is in the threat state, we're very overwhelmed. The limbic system, the collection of areas at the back of our brain, is very, very overwhelmed. That's our sensory input centers. Now, the difficulty is when that bit is overactive, we can't access the prefrontal cortex at the front of our brain, which is our complex decision-making, attention areas. We have 2 systems in there that it's really important that we use, not just if you're a leader, but in everyday life. One is about how we approach tasks. It's called the task network or the task positive network. And the other is all about how we attend to other people, called the default mode network, or I call it the empathic network. Now, in life, we need to be able to do things that are complicated, and we need to be able to attend to other humans, and leaders need to be able to do those 2 things very well. But when the limbic system, the sensory system, is overactive, we don't have proper access to the prefrontal cortex. So isn't that useful to know? Then the rest of the book goes on to talk about, okay, we don't want the brain in a threat state for yourself or other people. We want the brain in the reward state, which is when we can use and access those 2 mechanisms in the prefrontal cortex.
Sounds beautifully simple. So that's the first. The first model is about threat and reward.
Yes, and that's actually a key premise of the book. And that why my methodologies are make everything very simple. If you want a more complex book, go and read more complex books. The idea of this book is to distill everything down into the parts you really need to know about. So
this is the first one. If we're threatened, we're not functioning properly.
Absolutely, 100%.
So we need to be rewarded. We need to reward other people.
It's not about rewarding. It's not even that. It's the reward is a rather confusing term because it doesn't actually refer to the mechanics of reward. It's a name that the neuroscientists have given to when the brain is calm, and able to think. So we need our brains able to properly think.
So that's one, right? So the second one.
The second one is called the mechanics of communication, and it comes from a methodology called transactional analysis, which is quite an old psychological methodology. But basically, what it says is that when we communicate from effectively different places, which depend on threat and reward. So when we are communicating from a threat position, when the brain isn't working terribly well, we communicate in a particular way. But when the brain is in that calmer sense, we communicate in another way. And guess what? When we're communicating in what I call the ineffective way, we are deeply ineffective. We have a poor impact on other people. We don't get our point across. People respond to us very poorly. But when we communicate in the other way, we have a much better impact on people. And so isn't it good to know that and know how to get there and know how to use those states that are effective, call those the effective ego states.
Okay.
So the second methodology is about that.
And then the third one?
The third one is all about change. And it's all about what happens to humans when we are facing any kind of change that we don't really want. Now, that can be to I don't know, something small like having to eat something for dinner that you don't really like, right through to something that I'm dealing with a lot in organizations at the moment, which is where there are enormous amounts of change. And interestingly, this year, that's what I'm seeing most in organizations, massive changes, really massive changes. So the idea there is that humans, I can go into these in more detail later if you need me to, humans go through quite a predictable process of of change, which actually I've got a graphic. I've got some graphics here. I haven't been using them, but we can have a little look at change. So here is a curve, an upside down curve, and the idea on the change curve is that a change comes along that we don't like, and we plunge down into lower mood and morale, and it takes a while. We can be down at the bottom of this curve for a bit, so we have quite strong emotions while we're in this lower section. We can get we can get sick, and we blame others when we're at the bottom, and then it takes a while to reorganize and accept. And quite a longer while until we commit. So, and are really used to this change. And these changes are around us all the time. This process is going on multiple times for us all the time. But what we also know is that there are, and these are the ones in squares. No, they're not. The ones in brown here. There are certain activities we can do that protect us from these changes, and inoculate us, so to speak. So again, when we're down here and have the strong emotions, we're in threat states. When we're coming up here and we're engaging in these things that are written in brown here, then we are able to be inoculated, and we get ourselves back into this way of making our brain work better, the reward states.
So if we're a leader now, armed with these three models, what can we do?
We could do all kinds of things. We could, let's have a look. There are 14 questions in the book. There's, how do you manage your relationships better? There's how do you get the best out of people? There's how do you make sure people aren't excluded? How do you make sure people are included? There's how do you get people to do what they're meant to be doing at work? I mean, we don't just come to work to have a jolly time, do we?
And do these use all the models, or just
some of them use some models? Some activities specialize, if you like, in a single model, but there's a section at the back which is the more complicated methodologies or things we have to do at work, and they use all the models. So if you were approaching the book and you wanted to think about how do I manage my time, I would just advise you to read the sections on the brain. But if you wanted to think about how do I not get into conflict or disagreement with other people, I would suggest you read the mechanics of communication. But if you want to look at something really complex, like how do I instill responsibility? How do I get people to do things at work? Then you'd need to use all three.
Well, let's look at some of these. And one of the questions you ask is, as you just alluded to, how do we manage with limited time? Everybody gets tired. Everybody's got too much on their plate, I'm sure. So how can these models help us to manage with limited time?
Sure. Well, I mean, I think time's a really interesting one, because guess what? When we're short of time and when we're stressed, guess what? Brain's in a state of threat. So then we start to make mistakes. Then we start to all kinds of time biases begin to crop up. There's a particular bias we have about time, which is we think if we do the easy thing first, we'll be able to do the hard thing just as quickly as we've just done the easy thing. It's a fallacy. But when we're in a threat state, we become very biased in our thinking. We make a lot of mistakes in our thinking. So to manage time, we've got to get ourselves into a reward state, into the calmer state. And there's lots of things we can do specifically to help our brain be organized, prioritize, and think about so that we can think about how to manage time better. Because sadly, when I did a big literature review a few years ago about how do we manage time, there is only one mechanism that works, and that's treating time as to do the maths, to treat time as a budget, and budget with time just like you'd budget with your finances. Some things have to come in, some things have to go out, some things have to be stopped at certain times. In order to do the maths, in order to do the complex thinking, guess what? We need our brains to be in the reward state. So there are certain things we can do to get us there, like be really well organized. There's a wonderful guy called Daniel Levitin who takes a neuroscience look at how we are organized. And he talks about things like writing lists as being what he calls a third brain. So if you're not writing things down or keeping lists or prioritizing, then your brain has an awful lot of noise, and that increases the threat. So to decrease the threat, keep a third brain, record it, have a repository for all the things that are going on in your brain. Chunk things up. If we've got a big task to do that seems huge and we keep putting it off. It's much easier if we start to chunk it and reward ourselves for each section of what it is that we're doing.
And is there like a quick way back to the reward state if we accidentally get ourselves into a threat state? Is there something we can do, like a bit of first aid, that will get us back?
Yes, and this operates on two levels. So there's some really quick things we can do. I was doing one just before we came on. It's all a bit disconcerting. So there's very quick things like, did you know if you say your emotions out loud, say if I was in a scanner machine and I named my emotion, before I named my emotion, what they'd have done in the experiment is they'd have made you anxious or made you angry. But if you say, I am angry or I am anxious, there is a moment when the readings on the scanner will go green, which means the stimulation has dropped, which means you have access to the prefrontal cortex. So saying your actual emotion out loud is a quick fix. What you mustn't do, though, is go, I'm feeling angry because, and then tell the whole story, because all of that does is increase the levels of feedback, stimulation. Exactly.
Again,
then there's things we can do that have an embodying effect, work on our body, breathing, checking your breathing. Mindfulness is classic. My favorite at the moment is called the physiological sigh. That's the one I was doing before we came on air. And the physiological sigh is, you literally take 2 breaths through your nose where you take 1. So it goes in, out, in, out. Apparently, you don't actually notice that you feel any more relaxed, but it's telling your limbic system, the bit that's very overstimulated, it's okay, calm down, there's no threat. Apparently it's pretty foolproof. I find it really useful. So there are all kinds of quick fixes, and then there's a whole set of things that we need to be, that aren't so quick, but we can be attending to, and there's 4 sets of those.
So we're good with time management now.
Yeah.
What about,
a lot more to it? Read the book.
What about people?
What about people?
Disagreements, arguments.
People.
How do we handle disagreements?
Okay, well, there's lots of ways of approaching that in the book. So let me go back to those mechanics of communication called the ego states, which means I have to pick up these pieces of paper on the floor, which is going to look a little inelegant, and stick these back on here. Pick these up. Oh. Okay, so we talked about the mechanics of communication, and I use this methodology from transactional analysis, which means the analysis of interactions. And we're looking here at what we call 6 states of self, which are called the ego states. And we communicate differently from each of these ego states. So the most important one we need in the workplace is called adult, which is where the part of ourselves where we communicate information to other people. We ask questions for information, we give information, we tell people things. We need to be doing that well at work. We need to be doing that well anyway. And you can see that these are written in blue and red. In the book, they're called effective and ineffective. So here, the blue is effective and the red is ineffective. So up here, we've got 2 states where we're engaging in some form of judgment. The red one is called critical parent. When we're communicating from critical parent, we've made a critical judgment about someone. And by critical, I mean, I'm okay, but you're not. You've got it wrong, mate. You really aren't doing a good job here. Whereas nurturing parent, when we're in nurturing parent and communicating, we've made a judgment that the person is okay, I'm okay, you're okay, and therefore I'm going to treat you with care and respect. So there's a very big difference in how we use judgment, because if I interact with you from a place of critical parent where I have judged you, the response is going to be very different. And we'll come back to the responses in a minute. So we have some ways that we judge people. We have some ways that we communicate information. And then we have some ways that we deal with our emotions. And the 2 that are really important here are rebellious child, which is where we are very defensive. Our emotions are causing us to defend and be quite angry and push back. Or there's one where we're quite avoidant. That's called compliance. And then there's another way of handling our emotions where we are open and honest about how we feel. Now, why am I taking you through those in detail? Because this is a reciprocal model. And the idea here is that each of these ways that we behave has a matching reciprocal response. So each time we are perceived by another person to behave in these ways, we get a matching reciprocal response. Let's take a look at those. Ooh. So we've start at the top. The blue ones are the effective ones. If I am using and communicating because I care about you. So if I'm showing you that I care, I'm going to ask you curious questions. I'm going to be interested in your welfare. I'm going to be concerned about you if something happens. If I'm using my information swapping communication skills, and if I'm being open and honest with you, if I'm using a combination of those, there is an 80% chance I'm going to get the same back from you. Isn't that's good to know, isn't it? That's what we want. Yeah. That's great. Yeah, we want that. But here's the problem. If I start judging you, I am 95% likely to get either the defensiveness back or the avoidance back. Now, that's no way to have a conversation, no way to manage, no way to lead, no way to be in a family. So knowing that these are available to us means we can choose them over these. And that's the point. It's all about learning how to choose the blue ones, not choose the red ones.
And presumably this applies outside of the workplace 100%. As well. Anybody can be using this to improve their relationships with anybody else.
Favorite emails, having done this in a workshop or mainly often on leadership development programs, my favorite emails of the last 20 years have always been, "Dear Kate, thank you for saving my marriage."
Wow.
Or "Thank you for improving the relationship with my kids," because yes, this is a leadership development book. It's actually full of basic everyday
life skills.
Basic life skills. Yeah. Sorry, don't mean to boast about it, but
no, it's good. Skills. And I think I've told you this before, that I wish I'd have read this book 30 years ago. It would have got me out of a few scrapes, and I'm sure would have made me a better leader. Let's talk about influencing people, and particularly if people are resistant and defensive.
Yes.
What strategy can we use to influence?
Well, I think there's a lot we can do. I'm trying to work out which model to go to, because there's so many ways we could approach this. Well, let's start by remembering that if somebody is resistant, what state is their brain going to be in?
The threat state.
State. Okay. So first of all, if we start to treat resistance as a threat state, then the first thing we're going to do is something that's going to be soothing, because that's going to help. We're not going to say calm down. That's never going to work. But we're going to do things like, you asked me earlier, what kinds of things are quick fixes? One of the biggest things that helps to soothe is to be grateful to people, to be grateful, to notice them, to show them that they matter, to show them that they have some place and belonging. So one of the most important things we can do as a starting point to influence and enable people not to be resistant so that they can think with us is to be grateful for their contributions, even if we don't agree with them. To be grateful that they've had the courage to speak out. So there are a number of soothing things we can do. The book goes in quite a lot of detail to what I think are 7 different things for people, conditions for people that create threat for different people. So if somebody's resistant, and this is particularly in a leadership context, being aware of which particular condition sets somebody off means you can do something about that. So, for example, one of those is for people who need a lot of control. Some people like to be in control of something. And if as a leader you are perceived to take that control away, you will be perceived as a threat and people will be resistant to that. So making sure that in place of the thing you're taking away, you're replacing it so the person maintains some kind of control is a way of decreasing resistance for that person. Another one is fairness. So if somebody you're working with is troubled a lot or sees unfairness all over the place, then making sure they see the transparency of why you're doing something, it decreases the chances that they'll see things as unfair. So many of the ways to deal with resistance are about knowing the person that you're working with, working out how to decrease threat for them, so that the two of you can then enter into a much more productive conversation.
Okay. Now, even those of us who aren't leaders, we all have a ringside seat watching our political leaders. And of course, in the age of social media, every move they make is scrutinized in detail. So I was interested to ask how you viewed our current leaders, and particularly what's happening at the moment, through the prism of your three models. So Keir Starmer is being attacked by all sides at the moment. What state do you think he's in? Very threatened.
Well, yes, very threatened. And thereby, and here is my hypothesis on the subject, which a lot of people, I guess, won't like. But from the minute Keir Starmer took on his premiership, it seems to me that there's been a threat every week. You know, I have leaders at the moment in the current climate. There was a leader a few months ago. I hadn't seen her for a few weeks, and she began her coaching session saying, I wake up every morning thinking, what fresh hell is going to happen this week? And I think it's the same for Starmer. And if you are facing some fresh hell every week, every day, your brain ain't going to be working very well. And that really interests me. I mean, who's around him helping him manage his brain? Because another thing I haven't talked about brain states is we need really good social support, but we need good, well-balanced social support, because otherwise we form echo chambers. So he'll have a need for social support, but presumably he's been sitting in an echo chamber. So what reinforcement has he been getting?
Well, it was reported this evening in the press that his wife had told him to carry on. So that's probably part of it.
Well, you know, I do wonder how his prefrontal cortex has been working over these last, is it 18 months now? More than 18 months, nearly 2 years. I do really wonder how. I'd love to put him in a scanner machine and find out what's happening in his brain, because my hypothesis is, because when we are not accessing our prefrontal cortex well, the quality of our decision making is poor. We don't attend to details. Even someone who is well known to be such a sort of technocrat as he is won't have our usual, we won't be able to use the strength of our abilities in the same way. So I really do wonder about what's happening to him neurobiologically.
So you think actually the worse it gets for him, the less well he's able to
100%.
deliver. And so he's in a spiral. He's in a doom loop.
Yes. And then the more criticism he gets, the more he stays in that state. Plus, there does still seem to be another crisis every week. I mean, there's no let up. You know, it would be hard for any human to manage in that situation.
Well, Zach Polanski, he is an interesting character. He said over the weekend that Donald Trump was unhinged.
Oh yes.
So there are two characters. Yes. Let's talk about both of them. What do you make of Polanski?
Well, the trouble is,
what do you make of Trump?
I don't really want to talk about Polanski because then I'm going to talk about me and not about me as a psychologist.
Okay. But from a psychological perspective,
I'm most perplexed by Polanski. Most perplexed. One of the things in psychology that's in our if you like, our terms and conditions, our standards, is we can't make a diagnosis if we haven't met the person, which I think is a bit of a get out of jail free card for this conversation. But I can talk about what's being written about Trump. I find what's being written about Trump really, really interesting, because there's a lot of talk about he is a very extreme narcissist and a psychopath. There's a wonderful article by Matthew Said, or Matthew Paris, one of the two, in the Times this weekend about he's an absolute genius.
Yes, it was Said.
Was it Said? Yeah, it was a great article. I am, one of the things that psychology teaches you, particularly clinical psychology, is to be curious over judgment. So I'm constantly curious about these people, rather than, it'd be very easy for me to say, they're all complete raging, whatevers. But I'm far more interested in, one of the things the book is very solid about is, if you are working with someone or with someone you don't understand, you have choices. And one of those choices is, do you take the time to understand where they're coming from? Because that's where the secrets lie in being able to interact with them more effectively. So there's a lot, as the book gets more nuanced and sophisticated, about working people out so that you can make choices about your own behavior, about how you are with them.
Now that's an easy thing to say, but a lot of what is in this book is about communicating with colleagues, and yet in many workplaces, well, I think possibly in all workplaces, there is something of an agenda where you can't really speak openly because you might say the wrong thing or you might offend somebody. So how does that work if you're trying to sort of unravel somebody with these psychological models?
I'm going to do that really irritating psychological thing. I'm going to ask you what in the book has piqued the question.
Well, it's not particularly something in the book. It's just my own experience of meeting people who used to work for me who've said, we had such fun, and isn't it a shame you can't you can't do that anymore. You can't say what you think. There's no banter. You can't sort of joke with people. So how do we communicate if we're constrained?
Which bit of that do you want us to pick up on? Because there's the woke bit, and I think that's an important thing to talk about. But there's also, how do we establish safe relationships in organizations, which is a big buzzword at the moment. So psychological safety in organizations is a big thing, and I think massively misunderstood.
Well, let's talk about that. That's a good start.
What do we expect by psychological safety? When I go in and talk with teams and they say, come and help us be more psychologically safe, I ask them, what do you mean by that? And invariably they'll say, we want to be able to say anything that we want. And I'll say, So psychological safety isn't actually about that. Psychological safety was invented, if you like, by a woman called Amy Edmondson, who wrote a very famous book in 2019. She'd been working at Microsoft, or was it Google? One of the two. And she'd been the in-house psychologist and working there for a long time and done a lot of studies about what made teams really open up to each other. And she called it psychological safety. But it turns out it's not about being able to say anything. It's actually about being able to tolerate discomfort. So it's about being able to be in a mild threat state, to be activated and still behave effectively. That's what psychological safety is about. So if we go back to the other point, which is how do we have banter? We've got to the point, both in society and in work organizations, where we can't say things that actually a lot of people want to say. And but that's because we're not tolerating the discomfort of it, because the point of psychological safety is to tolerate that discomfort and work through it. And we seem to have got to a point where, well, my theory is, and there's a lot of people writing about this in the psychological journals, is haven't we psychologists done a great job? We've made people highly emotionally literate. They can now talk about their feelings. People can talk about their mental health. I think that's fantastic. I really, really do. We can talk about difference. It's absolutely wonderful. But it's come with the expectation that anybody can say anything without having any personal responsibility for how they say it. And thereby, for me, lies the difficulty, that we're in a sort of transitional phase where we don't have many boundaries. So people can say what they want and they expect to be heard, listened to, and their entire agenda taken on board. That's actually not logical. It's not logical and it's not rational. And it's really, really difficult. So organizations are beginning to put the boundaries back in place. I was working with an organization last week. I was working with all the people who facilitate all kinds of relational practice in an organization. And we were talking about boundaries and how we put the boundaries back in place. What I mean by that is how we start to set expectations again. There was a trend in about 2012 that you'd go to work in a new organization and you'd get a contract at the beginning, and it would say, when you work here, this is what we expect of you. That's your job description or your contract. But it also say, this is what you can expect of us. And these dual expectations were really popular at workshops, in teams, and they seem to have disappeared. And this setting expectations and setting boundaries about, if you speak your mind, what's appropriate to happen, seems to have disappeared. And a lot of psychologists at the moment are writing about how do we put the responsibility back. So if you choose to say something, what's the responsibility that comes with that? So I think we're in an interesting transitional phase. People are so much better at talking about what's important to them, and rightly so, and talking about difference and talking about how they feel excluded. Really, really important that we do that. How we do that.
But that's not banter. That's
no, true. True.
That's I suppose to some extent people presenting themselves as victims, people presenting themselves as suffering in some way, and expecting that everybody else in the workplace will bow to their
True. It's not
to their
banter.
foibles. But to make a joke, if it's the wrong kind of joke, could get you in a lot of trouble.
And I think that's right. I mean, we live in an age where we're so much more aware of people's sensibilities, and you know, if I chose to make a joke about somebody at somebody else's expense when I perhaps don't know them very well, and I say choice because it will be a choice, I get into those dynamics we were just looking at before. If I don't position it well and it looks like I'm judging them or I've got an agenda, I'm 95% likely to cause harm to that person. So I do have a problem with banter, but I think we can be honest and have open, honest fun. But there are some things that I genuinely do agree with that need to be off the table.
Interesting. Now, the examples we've discussed have used one or other of the models.
Yes.
So what happens if we put all three together?
Yes.
What can we achieve?
Okay, so let's pick a topic here. Let's look at, well, my favorite topic and the topic that leaders brought me most in when I was writing the book, so 23, 24, was how do I instill responsibility or accountability? So what they mean by that is, so I think that leaders over the last few years are in what I call, well, it started off, I called it a double bind. Now I call it a quadruple bind. So I think leaders are trying to do an awful lot of things, or not trying, are expected to do a lot of things all at the same time. So I think they're expected to keep the show on the road, get results, but at the same time, they're now expected to be effectively therapists because the well-being agenda is so, rightly so, we know that well-being, it's not a red herring. Well-being has been well proved to really, if you have good well-being in your company, your results are likely to be 10% higher than other people's. Very, very well proven these days. So leaders have to be strategists and taskmasters, and they have to be well-being advisors and quasi-therapists. They also have to keep their organizations safe. So we've just talked about psychological safety, but there's also, all kinds of threats. I mean, our community is a case in point, but just look at the AI agenda. And then they've got to prevent themselves from burning out. So in a way, leaders have got to do 4 tasks at the moment that are almost oppositional. Looking after people and pushing them are oppositional tasks. So to do all, the book is really about how to manage in that environment. So, we need to be thinking, I think, about all those models, because we need to be thinking about how do we get the best out of ourselves and other people. So how do we enable people to stay in the reward states? And there are multiple methodologies in the book to do that. How do we choose effective communication methods so that we don't get into ineffective communication patterns where, I put up the graphic before of the 95% of people would react badly to a particular communication style. That means that somebody's not going to do what you ask them to do. Somebody's not going to engage with you. So how do we make sure we stay in those blue ones? That involves a lot of choice and strategy about thinking about how you communicate. And then almost everything we're asking people to do is something different. So we're presenting change all the time. So what I call those 4 tasks of transition, making sure we're attending to why we're doing something, purpose, is actually really important for the brain. Could come back to that later if we wanted to. Making sure people are heard, making sure that you're clear with people what you want, this idea of expectations, and making sure there's an environment which they feel comfortable. You put all 3 models together, and in that lies how we ensure that we are communicating to people what we want them to do, whilst at the same time making sure that they have low resistance, high reward, and feel that they matter. So it's a lot of nuance. It's a lot you've got to be doing to get to that position, which for me requires all those 3 models.
Just a reminder to our audience,
look at that.
If you have some questions, now would be a good time to type them into the Q&A. So can anybody be a leader?
Yes and no.
Okay, good answer.
Yeah. So, I mean, I wouldn't be in a job if I didn't believe that people can learn skills to help them lead effectively. However, I do see some people who are not cut out to be leaders. And I'm working with I work with a lot of scientists, engineers in different companies. And one of the ways you progress in those environments is you become either a technical expert or you become a leader of a function. And one of the reasons there are technical experts is because early on in those companies, they realized that not everybody would have good people skills. The Charlie Mayfield did a massive study about sickness over the summer for the government. And he really concluded, one of his many conclusions was that, as many people have concluded before him, is that if you don't have good people skills, you're not really going to be a good leader, because so much of what 21st century leadership is relational. You need to have a good brain and be a good strategist, but if you can't get on with people, if you can't motivate them, decrease threat for them, that ain't going to work. So there's a section in the book about being brave and admitting to yourself when perhaps leadership is not right for you.
Well, yeah, I mean, I was going to ask you, how do you know when actually you're the problem rather than
the book asks this question.
Yeah.
I ask this question many times, and sometimes this doesn't go down very well. Someone will be knocking at my door and saying, "It's all the other people's fault. This is terrible. They're doing this to me." And my first question will always be, well, not my first question, because I wouldn't go down very well, but a question along the way will be, I'm wondering whether there's anything that you're doing that's playing a part in this. And we will use these methodologies to analyze whether or not actually part of the problem lies with the individual. In my experience, quite a lot of the time it is, but it's sad to say, and that goes for me too. I've worked in workplaces, and sometimes I've had to own up to the fact that some of these issues lie with me, or partly lie with me. And there's a lot in the book about making choices, and there's a lovely quote somewhere about from Obama, which I really love, which I don't think I can actually quote right now, but the essence of it is that it's up to us to make changes. I worked for a very, very wise man from which I learned a lot of this stuff, called Mark Hamlin, and he had a really lovely way of putting this, which was he used to say, if you want somebody to change, the only person you can actually change is yourself. And again, this is a key sort of part of the book. The idea is, if you want other people around you to be different, it's up to you to make the changes first, and see if through attracting their behavior towards you, attracting them through communication, engaging them through that communication, you can work together better. So I think a lot of this is about looking at yourself first.
So we have a couple of questions. We're asked, is this going to be available elsewhere? So there will be a recording of this on the Milim website, and of course you can always buy the book, which is a much better idea.
It's on Amazon, and it's with Routledge, and if you contact me, I can get you a 20% discount code. How about that?
Which is worth having.
Yes, because it's not cheap. It's not a cheap book. Yeah.
And the other question from Claire Sander is, can poor Keir Starmer be rescued? I don't think that's probably beyond the scope of...
If you'd have asked me that 6 months ago, maybe, but it sounds like the knives are out right now, so I'm not sure.
Let's talk about, this is sort of all based on psychological theory, but it's theory that's evidenced by experimentation.
And by real life.
But we're human beings. We're complicated. I mean, is it really that simple that there's these sort of Pavlovian responses to things? Surely we're far more complicated than that.
Yes and no.
Yes and no.
Yes and no. I've been working with people for one-on-one in groups for 40 years, and if there weren't methodologies that we can use to help ourselves, then I wouldn't be in business and I wouldn't have written a book. So yeah, we are really, really complicated. We're incredibly complicated and nuanced, and we're all different, but there's still, I think, an awful lot we can do to manage better in the world and manage each other better, engage each other better. And it's nice. These are nice, simple techniques to learn.
What you've done with great skill in this book is you've explained complex psychological theory in language that's accessible.
Yeah.
What was the hardest, in your view? What was the most difficult thing to explain in the book?
That's really hard for me to answer because I've been doing this for so long,
and
these things are second nature. Yeah, I'm trying. That question's really foxed me. I don't actually know. Not sure.
You're obviously just a natural.
No, I don't. I'm natural, just well rehearsed, Jonathan.
In being able to
just been using this stuff a long time.
Now, there's a lovely concept in this book called strokes.
Oh, yes.
Tell us about strokes.
Oh, well, first of all, it's not about touching anybody.
No.
So there's this lovely phrase from the 50s or 60s. It's an American phrase. It actually comes from transactional analysis, which is different strokes for different folks. So let's start at the beginning with this. A stroke is, in psychological terms, a single unit of recognition. Recognition is a really, really big topic at the moment in terms of how we decrease threat. So strokes are about how do we offer recognition to others as a way of how do we get the best out of them, how do we engage with them. And strokes come in many, many different shapes and sizes. So there's the number of strokes. Some people like loads of strokes and some people like just a tiny amount. So knowing who likes plenty and who likes a few. There's people in my life that if I showered them with strokes, showered them with recognition, they'd run a mile and hate to be with me. But there's other people in my life who I know that to have a really good time with, we need a lot of recognition, we need a lot of engagement, we need a lot of chat, we need a lot of notice about what's going on with each other. So one is about the number, then there's the type. So types of strokes come in all kinds of shapes and sizes. My usual story involves my sister-in-law, and I know they're all watching, so apologies to my sister-in-laws, but here's my favourite stroke story. So when Jonathan and I got married, I come from a family, and all my family are watching, so I feel a bit uncomfortable telling these stories, but these are the ones I tell at work. I come from a family where the sign of recognition is being independent. So I told you, strokes come in all shapes and sizes. So in my family, we were recognized, we were praised for being independent. And I'm married into a family where interdependence is important. So the very first time I went shopping with my lovely sister-in-laws, thank you, I admired a jumper and it was bought for me. Now, in my family, you'd have had to work for that because you'd have had to acquire it through your own mechanism. So I was really foxed at the beginning by this. This is one of the things that happens between us, is we have different ways of showing each other recognition, and when they get muddled up, they can cause all kinds of problems. Because I was deeply offended by that. I was deeply offended that people came away and took away my independence. And so it took a few years, didn't it, sister-in-laws, for us to all settle into this, because our ways of being with each other are quite different. And we encounter that all the time with all kinds of different people. And the book's a lot about how do we find the right strokes for the right folks. Because if you give the person the right stroke, the right form of recognition, then you're going to get the best out of them and the relationship's going to go better. So there's lots in here about the different types of strokes.
So we should all learn what strokes the people around us respond best to.
Yeah.
So with the rise of AI, which is disruptive in a big way, and working from home, our needs for connection as humans haven't changed, but the environment has. So what psychological skill will define the successful leader of the next decade?
Well, I'm going back to my being able to manage in the quadruple bind.
Yeah.
You're going to need to have relational skills. You're going to need to be quite creative, especially how do you draw people in when you're working with them online. I work with two companies at the moment who are international and completely remote. And so there is no office, and they have to work across time zones. And there are many, many people doing these days. And they're coming up with more and more inventive, creative ways of keeping connected. During the pandemic, we saw lots of games, didn't we? But now we're seeing different kinds of timing lengths for meetings and check-ins so that people are having daily contact. One of the companies I work with has started to do monthly hubs. So if you work in eastern side of America, once a month there'll be a gathering in Washington. If you work in the west of America, there'll be a gathering once a month or once every 2 months in San Francisco. Here it might be London or Cambridge, because if you don't have those hubs and bring people together, actually the communication isn't good. So I think AI is really interesting. I think AI, one of the problems we're seeing with AI is it's becoming a substitute for people. And that really, well, I think a lot of people are really troubled about that people will consult ChatGPT or Copilot or whatever instead of talking to another human. And, we know that, with the number of suicides, sadly, that we're not always getting particularly good relational advice. So I am worried about that.
Interesting. So, one book under your belt. Anything else? Anything else in the pipeline?
I do have another idea for a book, but it's a much bigger undertaking. And one of the other reasons for writing the book, I mean, I run a consultancy, and let's face it, one of the reasons of writing the book was a marketing ploy, and so far the marketing's been very successful. So right now I don't have time to write a book. So the plan was to sort of retire gracefully, start working 4 days a week and 3 days a week. Bring out a book doesn't quite happen. Now working 6 days a week. Yes, it did work. But so too busy to write the book. But I do have another idea for a book, which would be another very practical book, but probably a bit more niche and not so much. I think despite the fact this is about leadership, it actually also has very broad appeal. And it's also meant to be for coaches, people who coach, and so that they can learn the skills to use with their clients. So this one's got quite broad appeal. I'm not sure I can ever be bothered to write the other, so we'll see.
So it's been a real joy to chat
Thank
to you. This book, as Kate says, it's on Amazon or Routledge, but do get in touch with Milim. We will share the discount code. Hopefully we can do that when we email everybody in the next day or two. It's, as we said, not a cheap book, but it's a really, really useful book. And I wish I'd have read this book a lot of years ago. And we have a little gift for you, Kate, to say thank you. Book of some of my photographs.
Well, thank you.
Which I hope you'll enjoy. That is a rare unsigned copy.
Would you like to sign it for me, Jonathan?
I can sign it, but its value will plummet. Now, just a few words about what we've got coming up before we leave you this evening. Next week, on Monday the 4th, we've got John Hillary joining us. He's talking about Magnates and Masterpieces, the German Jewish collectors of Edwardian England. An absolutely fascinating look at German emigres to this country and the vast collections of art that they bought, most of which ended up being given to the state. And then the following week, we welcome Daniel Rachel to discuss his book, This Ain't Rock and Roll, Pop Music, the Swastika and the Third Reich. And this is about Nazi imagery working its way into popular music and popular culture. To book for either of those, visit milim.org.uk. You can sign up to our newsletter there, and that way you will be certain to be first to hear about anything we're presenting. All our online events are free, but you can make a donation if you want. You'll find a link on our website to do so. This year being our 10th anniversary, we're hoping to raise a fund of £5,000 to help to fund our programme, so please do give generously. So it remains to me to thank our guest, Kate Pearlman-Shaw. Once again, thank you so much, Kate.
Pleasure.
And looking forward to seeing you all again next time. Until then, stay safe. See you soon.